Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. Reepicheep, he's many people's favorite character. If you do a vote on your favorite Narnian character, it tends to be Puddleglum in Silverchair or Reepicheep in Prince Caspian and Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But interestingly, he wrote a young woman an outline of the 7 Chronicles, and he said, obviously, Magician's Nephew is creation, the redemption happens in line with the wardrobe, and Voyage of the Dawn Treader is really about a spiritual quest. And he says the spiritual quester is Reepicheep, and he says he's a type of mystic. Even though he's a knight errant and he's very chivalrous, or I guess a knight rodent you would call him in this. He's very chivalrous and concerned about his honor. But he heard this poem from his dryad nurse about the utter east. And it's very much, he's having his own experience of Sehnsucht. And the way that Lewis loved northernness, Reepicheep loves easternness, and he wants to go as far east as possible.
Welcome to our 3rd episode of the Into Narnia series, where David Downing and I, Crystal Downing, are discussing the Narnia Chronicles with Aaron Hill, our producer come theologian. And
I'm going to put that on my business card.
Yeah.
So I just want to get right into our conversation about Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And first of all, David, what energized this plot for Lewis? Did he start thinking about it as he was finishing up Prince Caspian? What inspired him?
Well, he wrote the whole thing in 3 months in late 1950. He didn't plan all 7 Narnia Chronicles. He started out, I'm going to try one. At the end, you can tell he wants to do a sequel. And then he thought for a while this might be a trilogy. This might be the last one. And you notice the Christian themes get very explicit at the end. He wants to make sure his readers got the point.
So when Aslan is cooking a breakfast on the beach for the children, I mean, it's just...
Yeah, the lamb.
Yes.
Some of the most transparent biblical imagery.
Yeah.
Right.
Getting back to his premise, he liked sea voyage stories, and he wrote in a letter he wanted to write a green and pearly story that was based on the kinds of adventures we find in the Odyssey and St. Brendan's Voyage. I don't find much of the Odyssey in it, but I find a lot of St. Brendan's Voyage. He's an Irish saint who was said to sail all over the North Sea, and there's a famous medieval poem about his adventures. And they go to a sheep island, and they go to an island of sleep, and they go to an island where an old man is fed by the animals. So there's a lot of similarities between St. Brendan's Voyage and a lot of the incidents we have here.
Oh.
A voyage narrative is great for a fantasy writer because it gives you a chance to string together a bunch of episodes and have a lot of different things going on.
Yeah, I was saying earlier, this feels like you could turn this into a TV show very easily. And this week, we go and see the Dufflepuds.
Right. And sometimes you could almost interchange the chapters.
Oh, yeah.
There is a Guide to Narnia, which I do not endorse, which thinks that each island represents a level of spiritual development. So
okay.
We're all enslaved by sin. We have to be liberated. And then we have to go and have our dragonish pride removed. And this person goes through each island and turns it into a pilgrim's progress.
Oh, really?
And I'm sure that Lewis didn't intend to be that allegorical.
Yeah, how would I wonder how the dream one would fit into that one. That would be a difficult one.
Right, or the...
Well, we need to talk about the Dark Island. That was the most revising he did of any of the Narnia Chronicles was on the Dark Island.
Oh, really?
He himself had nightmares his whole life. In some of his letters, he would describe these really bizarre dreams where he sees his brother in the window in the shape of a bat and he's crying, "Help me,"
Oh my gosh.
He had very disturbing dreams. And the British edition, he sort of poo-pooed the Dark Island. They went in, they found Roop, and the land of dreams is not just dreams, but nightmares.
Yeah.
And at the end of the British edition, as they came out, they all made fun of it and said, oh, how silly we were to be worried about all those imaginary monsters. And they look back and the Dark Island has completely disappeared.
Yeah,
and
that's the version that I have.
That's the version you have.
Yeah.
Well, you have the defective version.
Oh, I do? Okay,
yeah,
all right.
Your spiritual growth is going to be somewhat deformed because of a lack of...
I mean, he almost could have had them say, and it was all a dream.
Yeah,
exactly. I felt that when I was reading it. I was like, well, okay.
Well, he decided in the American edition to revise that section because he didn't want to poo-poo children's night fears. He remembered people say it was only a dream, don't worry about it. And even as an adult, he was disturbed by his dreams. So he went back and rewrote it, and the Dark Island just slowly fades into the distance.
Oh, okay.
But they don't make fun of their experience. They take seriously their night fears.
Huh, okay.
So
Well, that then strikes me as all the more significant that he is clearly alluding to Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner
Oh my gosh. I mean,
in this novel.
There's the chapter where it literally mentions an albatross at the end of the chapter.
Oh, yeah. The albatross that actually leads them out of the nightmare, the darkness. But what I love about it is that Lewis takes, and once again, we're back to Romanticism. Go back and listen to our earlier podcast about the power of Romanticism on the various authors at the Wade Center. But here is this romantic poet, Coleridge, who really is describing a nightmare existence on a voyage. And so this mariner, however, kills the albatross that was leading this boat out of its dire circumstances. And so it's as though Lewis is saying, I'm writing about a voyage, about mariners who reverse that situation.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, the Ancient Mariner, when he kills the albatross, he has to hang it around his neck as this burden. But there are a lot of echoes.
Oh yeah, right after that, because it says at the end of the Dark Island chapter, at least in my defective British edition, it says, "But nobody noticed when the albatross had disappeared." It's the very last line, and I was like, "Wow!" I mean, it could not be more clear what you're doing there, Lewis. And then in the next chapter, he starts instead of what happens in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where once the albatross is killed, the sun is beating down on them, and then he has this weird vision where he sees luminous figures on the ocean, and then he sees the ghost ship, and in the very next chapter, Lewis writes, "The luminous dance of the foam thrown up by their bows." And there's a lot of phrases like that, and they just feel ripped straight out of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but he's reversing all of the bad things that happen in the poem. So that really stood out to me.
Right.
We're so glad Eustace didn't try to shoot the albatross.
I know.
Yeah, that's right.
Except late in the story when he's been reformed.
Yeah, even in Coleridge's poem, there's this looking at the shadow of the ship and seeing, he actually says, I watch the rich attire of what he sees in the sea, just as Lucy does.
Yeah.
And the famous stanza where Coleridge writes, "Oh, happy living things, no tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware." And that is the moment when the albatross falls off his neck and he can pray.
Yeah.
But Lewis reverses that insofar as Lucy prays first.
Yeah.
And then the albatross comes and leads them. And I also love that moment where it says that she looked along the light. They see this beam of light. She looked along the light. And doesn't that remind you of Tools in a Woodshed, where you have to look along the light?
Meditation in a tool
meditation in a tool shed. Oh yeah, tools in a tool shed.
I have tools in a woodshed.
Yeah.
Lewis has meditations in a tool shed.
Tools in a meditation shed.
Why don't you summarize Meditations in a Tool Shed?
Well, he's in a dark tool shed, and the sunlight is coming through a crack in the wall, and it's making this beam of light. You can see the motes dancing in the dust. And he says, if you look at the beam, it's simply a flat plane of light with dust motes in it. But if you align your eye with the beam, you can look out and you can see the sun and the sky and the grass and the trees. And he says, many times when you look at something, you don't really understand what it is. You have to look along the beam of light. And I think you're exactly right. He's using that image in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. She's able to look along the beam. She understands the spiritual dimension of their expressions. Once again, Lucy's always the most sensitive.
Right. She's the most Christ-like.
Yeah. But she does have a close call in here. Well, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
Let's talk about Eustace. I have to say, I think Lewis's introduction at the beginning of this is probably, and I'm probably biased, but I think it's probably one of the best openings to a novel
Yes.
I've read.
There was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it.
Yeah.
Yeah, once again, that's a satire on progressivism. He calls his parents by their first names.
Oh my gosh. Yeah,
And,
Harold. And they're vegetarians.
Yeah, they're vegetarians.
Like, what does Lewis have against vegetarians?
Oh, but they also don't drink or smoke. So once again, evil people are the ones who don't drink and smoke. A total reversal of my growing up as a fundamentalist.
Yeah.
And they wear special underwear.
Well, and he likes beetles, but only with pins in them.
Right.
Like dead on a thing.
You kill rather than blessing creatures unaware, the way the ancient mariner talks. You kill them and inspect them, which is very similar to the idea of meditations in a tool shed, where people think, oh, I've got to inspect Christianity, not realizing that if I look along the inside of Christianity, it points me to explanations of the meaning of existence. And people get obsessed with, well, I don't see the possibility of miracles and all that.
Yeah, and in Lewis's fiction, spiritually infirm people always disregard the sanctity of life, whether human or animal. So even being willing to kill a bug. It's very typical of what we see in Uncle Andrew later on, what we see in Weston Divine in the Ransom trilogy.
So what is Lewis trying to satirize or trying to portray here with Eustace and his parents? Because it seems like there's a lot of things kind of mixed together here. They're vegetarians. There's a whole thing about open windows, and he calls his parents by their first names. What is Lewis trying to sort of satirize by Lewis and his parents here?
I think it's mainly progressivism.
Okay.
It's the same thing that comes up when we go to the Lone Islands and meet Gumpus. He's called His Sufficiency. That's also great satire.
With the
novel
bureaucracy.
has some of the greatest satire of all the Chronicles, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's mainly, he kind of liked the mainstream. He sort of liked... he wrote an essay called Why I'm Not a Pacifist. He certainly wasn't a vegetarian, but I think he kind of felt like these were newfangled ideas that were not kind of like good old-fashioned, solid, British meat and beer sort of thing.
Yeah, because Eustace is a pacifist, except for he only invokes it when Reepicheep wants to attack him because he's been swinging him around by his tail.
And his education is bad. Obviously, he should have been reading fantasy stories and fiction.
I love that line when it says that, he had read none of the right books. They had a lot to say about exports and imports and governments and drains, but they were weak on dragons.
Yeah, I think it also has to do with going back to that insight of looking at the light and trying to analyze the light rather than looking along the light. And so I think he associates progressivism with a disdain for anything imaginative or supernatural.
Oh.
And then, of course, Eustace is the most incredible narcissist.
Oh, my gosh.
And the trouble with a lot of people who are able to use their rational faculties, they use those rational faculties to justify their behavior. So I thought that was a brilliant move on Lewis's part to have the narrative come through via Eustace's journal, where he says, oh, I'm just thinking of the other people. I don't want to wake them up. I'll just go get the water that I've been told not to get, but it's because I'm thinking of other people. And it's so obvious that he is thinking just of what serves his own best interest.
Yeah. So, David, am I right in thinking that when he talks about the open windows that, they're just focusing on fresh air, but they're not really enjoying the outdoors? There seems to be this, like Crystal was saying, this sense of looking at things, but not really enjoying them for what they were made for. Is that kind of what Lewis is satirizing there?
Yeah, I think so. He felt that his own parents were overprotective when he was growing up in Ireland. It was wet a lot, and they made him stay indoors a lot. So there may be a little bit of satire on the overly protective parents.
Gotcha.
But Eustace, it's interesting in Eustace's case because rather than being able to we talked about Edmund's moral descent, kind of line by line, and then his moral recovery. And for Eustace, it's much more dramatic because he's pretty much a pill. He's pretty much a brat until this episode on Dragon Island. And then I love the whole, everybody loves the episode of he tries to get rid of his dragon skin peel by peel, and he can't get to the core of his being. And finally, Aslan says, well, I'm going to have to do that. And he has this terribly painful moment of feeling Aslan's claw ripping him to the core of his being.
Yeah.
But then out comes a little boy. It's a wonderful spiritual metaphor. About the time he was writing the Chronicles, he wrote to Arthur Greaves a letter, and he says, I've been trying to deal with my pride. Every time I get rid of some pride, there's just another layer of pride under that, and then there's pride under that.
Yeah.
And finally, when I achieve a certain measure of humility, I'm proud of my humility. So I think he took that spiritual condition and gave us an objective scene to talk about.
Yeah, and I really liked his description of Eustace's transformation, spiritual transformation, when he says that he began to be a different boy. The cure had begun, that he wasn't perfect from that point on. And I think that's a really direct spiritual statement about how sanctification and salvation actually works.
Right.
Okay, yeah, you've been forgiven and Christ has transformed you, but you're still a work in progress. You know, the cure had begun. Right. And I really like that line.
Yeah, and that wonderful moment when he's playing chess with Reepicheep and his former nature comes through, his competitiveness. But that's the way it really is. I mean, even St. Paul talks about the thorn in his flesh, and you have a sense that there is something he's struggling with, even though he has had a Damascus Road experience.
Yeah.
Well, Lewis is good that way because Caspian, we found out in Prince Caspian, is a true Narnian, and Edmund grew up after his experiences in Lion, Witch, the Wardrobe. But all three of these characters who we think of as squared away, my dad was the Navigators, and maybe are you squared away? I think it has to do with your bunk is correctly made and you're
gotcha. With
you're
the
ready for
squares in the
inspection.
corner?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So my great goal growing up was to be squared away. I thought that was near unto sainthood. But in any case, you think they're squared away. But Edmund has a struggle at the Goldwater because he starts getting greedy for this pool that will turn everything into gold. And he and Caspian get into that. And then Lucy, of course, we're going to have to get to Magician's Island eventually, but the temptations in the book, she succumbs to temptation several times.
Yeah, everybody has a moment of temptation in the book.
So once again, going back to your idea that once you begin the journey of sanctification, that's a lifelong journey. That's not an instant conversion.
Yeah. So, but I was going to ask you, the seven lords concept, which kind of animates their quest partially, that was introduced in the preceding novel, at least in terms of the publication order that we've discussed. So in Prince Caspian, we learn about these seven lords that have been sent off. Was that something that Lewis had the idea for Voyage of the Dawn Treader then and put that into the first story, or was that something that came out of it later? What was the order with that? Where did the seven lords come in?
I have a feeling that you're right. I think as he started writing, he started thinking of sequels. I believe he planted the seven lords in the story so that he'd have a spine for the plot structure of this story.
Okay, gotcha.
You can tell at the end of this story, Lucy and Edmund can't come back, but he says, well, Eustace might be able to come back. And I see the wheels are already turning for the silver chair.
Gotcha,
He's going to come in this next novel. Back to Reepicheep. He's many people's favorite character. If you do a vote on your favorite Narnian character, it tends to be Puddleglum in Silver Chair or Reepicheep in Prince Caspian and Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But interestingly, he wrote a young woman an outline of the 7 Chronicles. And he said, obviously, Magician's Nephew is creation. The redemption happens in Lion, Witch, the Wardrobe. And Voyage of the Dawn Treader is really about a spiritual quest. And he says the spiritual quester is Reepicheep.
Yeah.
And he says he's a type of mystic, even though he's a knight errant and he's very chivalrous, or I guess a knight rodent, you would call him in this. He's very chivalrous and concerned about his honor. But he heard this poem from his dryad nurse about the utter east where the water is sweet.
Yeah.
And it's very much, he's having his own experience of Sehnsucht.
Right.
And the way that Lewis loved northernness, Reepicheep loves easternness, and he wants to go as far east as possible.
Yeah.
So Lewis said that he's actually an image of someone on a spiritual quest.
Oh. So I was going to ask you about that. There is a theme that I felt I'd noticed kind of running through the story, and Reepicheep is part of it. Reepicheep very much to me felt like a knight going on a crusade, back when the Crusades were still romanticized. And he's going to have this sort of spiritual experience, but he's literally almost like seeking a grail. And you get to the stone knife, and the stone knife almost feels like it's functioning kind of like a grail, like it's been taken from the stone table, and then it's here at the beginning of the end of the world, and they've sort of preserved it at Aslan's table, and it feels like it's it's the knife that cut Aslan as opposed to the cup that caught the blood of Christ or whatever. And so there definitely feels like there's that grail aspect to the story, and Reepicheep is kind of this knight that's going on a crusade. Is that part of what Lewis is doing here with Reepicheep?
Well, he's seeking the object of the rhymed song that he heard from his nurse.
Yeah.
in Lewis, nurses are always good guides to spiritual intuitions. He really loved his nurse when he was young, growing up in Belfast.
Oh, okay.
Almost as much as he loved his own mother. So Caspian's nurse tells him what's really going on with Narnia, and she gets expelled.
Thrown away. Yeah.
And then Reepicheep's nurse gives very good clues about the utter east. So I wouldn't say it was the knife. I would say it is the utter east concept.
Yeah.
He loved William Morris, and William Morris has a quest for the land that's west of the moon and east of the sun. So there's a little bit of William Morris in this quest for unknown horizons.
But Aaron has a point because Lewis explicitly alludes to the King Arthur mythology.
Right.
He says, if King Arthur came back to Britain as some people say he will.
And I say the sooner the better.
Yes.
This is that avuncular narrator again who's sitting by the fireside or by the bedside reading a story and commenting now and again on the storyline. Yeah, I think you are right about that knife being grail-like, or it's also like the spear of destiny, the spear that pierced the side of Christ.
Yeah.
That this tool of wounding becomes this enchanted object.
Yeah, but the fact that it's been preserved and taken and there's something sacred about it is definitely something that comes from that grail background, which is funny because growing up as a Protestant evangelical, the idea that there was anything significant about something that killed Jesus or,
Any kind of relic, right?
Yeah. Because I always thought like, well, what about, did he drink out of cups at other points in his life? Are those cups not special too? But that's just my, Protestant, background.
Right.
Let's take a moment for a commercial. The Spear of Destiny appears in my novel, Looking for the King.
Oh, it does.
2 Americans in 1940 go looking for the Spear of Destiny, and they meet Lewis and Tolkien. Available at fine bookstores everywhere. Now, back to our regular program.
So let's talk about the first sort of main island, the Lone Islands that they come to, and the Calormen. And we meet the first of the lords named Bern, which, if I'm right, is Old German for bear. Did the other names have any significance? What's going on with the Lone Island? And there's Gumpus, and there's a lot of things happening. And why is Lewis talking about slave trading in a children's novel?
I know, that's true. That's true. Well, we talked about his vocabulary. He talks about the galleons and the carracks and the cogs.
Yeah.
And, poltroonery. He, as a child, he was extremely precocious. And he said, no books in my parents' library were barred from me. I could read many things that was okay to read, many things I shouldn't have been reading at that age.
Oh, okay.
So I think as he's writing for himself as a child.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know that many children personally. And I think he's forgetting that most children are not reading Shakespeare and Milton in their early teens.
And or about slave traders.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about names, but he loved the sounds of words, and a short U almost always indicated a debased character or a comical character, like Dufflepuds, and Pug is the name of the slave trader.
Yeah.
And
Gumpus.
Gumpus. Although there's Puddleglum.
Well, but he is kind of a humorous character.
That's true.
And also in Silver Chair, when we get to it, we're going to meet Mulligathurum. He's got 4 short U's in his name.
Huh.
I think he was very sensitized to the sounds of words. Narnian names tend to end I-A-N.
Yeah.
Caspian and Rillian. You just mentioned Octesian. Apparently, there's a lot of Armenian Narnians there. But bad characters tend to have sharp names or names with kind of a thudding short U sound.
Huh.
Like Nickabrick, we talked about in the last novel.
Rabidash and all these characters.
Interesting.
I don't know about the meaning of any of the names. They seem to me like more for the sounds.
Okay, gotcha. I didn't know if there was any sort of scheme to the 7 lords' names. The Bern one stood out to me because I've taken German, and I just thought maybe there's, Bear, because he's loyal to Caspian when they, turns out he bought Caspian as a slave because he thought he looked like Caspian, and then he is Caspian.
I think if you're clever enough, you could write a book on that very subject.
Oh, yeah?
The secret meaning of the names of the 7 lords.
Well, some of the lords are going to get rough because there's Roop and what are the other guys? But my favorite part of that section is where he breaks into the castle.
Right.
And Gumpus is trying to delay them with all this bureaucracy.
Right.
Yes.
It felt like Lewis was attacking all committee meetings and everything that he hated about campus bureaucracy scene.
Yeah, he did. I mean, he associated modern government with that kind of bureaucracy. And he had this idealized view of the medieval government. You notice when Caspian throws him out, he said, I've had enough of governors. We're going to make Lord Bern the Duke.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
So he has this romanticized idea that things were more organized when when people had inheritance title. He didn't literally believe that. He said, I agree with Aristotle that the reason I disagree with slavery is not that no one deserves to be a slave, but that no one deserves to be a master. No one has that much power or should have that much power over another human being.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but that is his manner of language is very slovenly.
Yes.
And he's you only come see me on Saturdays between 2 and 3.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a great scene. That was very
and then
humorous.
he's like, well, we've got to bring that to a vote, and we'll have to convene the committee for that, and all these kinds of things. And
well, he hated committee work. He would fall asleep in faculty committees, and sometimes when he was asked to take minutes, he would write them out in rhyming couplets like a Shakespearean play.
Yeah.
So he had to do something to keep himself from being bored.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the other islands. So there's the Lone Island where they sort of get rid of the slave trade, and it does feel very much like a children's story. So they get rid of the slave trade, and Burns like, hey, there may be some problems. A war may be started because of this, and Caspian and they're like, well, good luck with that. See you later. We're off on an adventure. And so then they leave and go off to what's the next island they go to after the Lone Islands?
That's a good question. I haven't got them in mind. Crystal,
well, that goes back to our point that it's very episodic.
It doesn't really matter which order they're in.
Assume that this is a type of spiritual progression doesn't seem warranted by the text.
Yeah, I think it's Dragon Island because right after they leave the Lone Islands, they have the big storm and the mast breaks in half. And there's that series of Eustace's journals. Why did Lewis include Eustace writing in his journal? What was his idea with that?
Crystal was talking about that earlier. It kind of shows his powers of rationalization and self-deception. Lewis actually liked Huckleberry Finn. He didn't generally like American literature.
Oh, okay.
But Huckleberry Finn is famous for having an unreliable narrator. Huckleberry doesn't really understand what's going on a lot of the time.
Uh-huh.
He thinks it's sinful to help liberate Jim the slave because he's been trained that way.
Yeah.
I think he's playing with the idea of the unreliable narrator.
Okay.
And we all do that. Throughout the Narnia Chronicles, Aslan tries to give people this moment of moral clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And often he just sits and waits for them to think about it and realize they're rationalizing.
Yeah.
So I think we're supposed to enjoy the humor of his thinking. He's very virtuous and upright and advanced.
Gotcha.
And I wanted to mention a piece of unfinished business. We talked about how each novel toward the end, he would start preparing for the next one.
Yeah.
With the Lone Islands, he says, did Narnia get the Lone Islands by conquest? No, they've always been a part of Narnia.
Yeah.
And he says, sometime I'll tell you the story of how the Lone Islands... I've always thought a great sequel would be to write a prequel about how the Lone Islands became to be attached to Narnia and then get a major lawsuit and spend the rest of my life in jail. The C.S. Lewis estate doesn't want anybody writing any kind of a
additional Narnia.
Riff on Narnia stories.
Oh, okay.
They made a band that named themselves Aslan or Aslan something, and the estate made them change the name because they thought that was an infringement of copyright.
Well, public domain is coming. That's going to definitely change in the future. I think the next island is the Dragon Island.
Right.
And I liked how Lewis, he even puts in those sort of small details where Eustace, he decides he's going to get away from everybody. And then immediately he figures out that he doesn't like being alone as much as he used to. So he's been changed just a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then it also says that he, it's really hard going up this thing. And it says, well, apparently he had been changed because he would have just given up right away before he came to Narnia.
Yeah, he's getting more physically fit.
Yeah, well, but also there's a level of determination that he didn't have previously. Right. And so he kind of includes those small details. Like there's a little bit of moral change that's happened in Eustace right before he becomes a dragon. So that when he does actually have that transformation, in the story, that it feels like it's a natural progression as opposed to kind of shocking you. At least that's the way it felt when I was reading the story.
Another thing in that chapter that Lewis loves to do, he loves to give you a bunch of sense impressions, but he doesn't tell you what it means or he doesn't interpret it for you.
What do you mean?
This goes all the way. This is when he wakes up and he thinks he's trapped between two dragons.
Yeah, the subjectivity.
And he says, when I move my left arm, it moves its claw. And when I move my right arm, and when I hold my breath, the steam. And going all the way back, like out of the Silent Planet, Ransom is looking at this huge moon. And he says, that's impossible. Am I going crazy? How could the moon? And slowly you realize he's looking at Earth from a rocket ship.
Yeah.
And he loves to do that same thing here. He gives you the sense perceptions, but then he makes it into kind of a riddle until you finally go, oh, he himself is turned into a dragon.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I love about studying literature and the value of literature is that a good writer illuminates human psychology. And just what you're talking about now, we talked about the psychology of Eustace by writing in his journal and his self-justification, but even then, how he perceives things. I still remember as an English major in college, I finally took my required class, Intro to Psychology, and I remember in the whole class, I was going, these people don't know this already? And it's just like, I learned nothing in that class that I hadn't learned from reading really good literature. I was given language to describe what this phenomenon was.
An explanation of it, yeah.
So that is also what is compelling about these Narnia chronicles, even though they're supposedly written for children, that they are illuminating psychology that's relevant to both of us. And Aaron, you talking about the order of the islands, it suddenly struck me going from this Gumpus who actually justifies slavery by saying, well, it's good economics.
Yeah.
And then a dragon, which is always associated with the hoarding of gold and jewels. And so Eustace wakes up surrounded by everything that Gumpus wanted to accumulate. And slavery for those in charge is probably good economics. It's horrible evil.
Yeah.
And it's as though Lewis is trying to say the accumulation of wealth, the consideration for making a lot of money is inimical to being in relationship with Aslan and getting to the east, to the world, to paradise.
Well, that comes up several times, the theme of greed. Goldwater Island turns into Deathwater Island.
Yeah,
and Gumpus is obviously financially motivated. And then this incident of his falling in love with the dragon's gold.
Well, and Lewis seems to always portray those kinds of decisions, people that decide to go that route, whether it's Gumpus approving of slavery or Eustace. It says he sleeping on a dragon hoard with greedy draconian thoughts in his heart, he had become a dragon himself. But I think the line that stood out to me that I think he's trying to portray all of these people, even the Lord that steps into the water and becomes a gold statue and he's just trapped down there forever, is he says of Eustace, he realized that he was a monster cut off from the human race. So just this idea that this greed, this desire to get things at all cost for yourself eventually leads to you being cut off from the human race. You turn yourself into a monster. And he sort of, allegorizes that with poor Eustace. And then I love the language it says of Eustace. He said he was huge and horrible and humpy.
Yes, that alliteration once again.
You know, when you read a lot of Lewis, you see these similarities. The slave trader Pug says, I don't do this for fun. And that's exactly what Divine said in Out of the Silent
Wow.
Planet. Because they're doing it for profit. So it's funny how they're kind of similar personalities.
Yeah.
They have no sense of moral guidelines. They just want profit.
Yeah, the accumulation of money.
Yeah, that profit for profit's sake. You end up like that lord at the bottom of that lake,
Right.
With gold, untold wealth, but the inability to enjoy it because you're trapped in this.
Yeah. Well, once again, you're no longer human. If that's
cut off from
your
the
there's a little bit of the Midas story there.
Yeah.
There's always these fables and ancient tales floating around in Narnia. Later on, he says it's like Androcles and the lion. Wasn't that in here?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it was.
So let's talk about the magician and the invisible Dufflepuds or monopods or whatever they're called. What was Lewis doing there? That seemed like a weird, random thing. And why are these creatures being tutored by this magician? I have a lot of questions about what he's doing there.
Well, once again, if you read the Voyage of St. Brendan, they go to an island where there's this big, beautiful mansion, but it's totally abandoned. And I got a little bit of that feeling.
Okay.
Monopods really are a classical entity.
Oh, really?
Lewis liked to draw them. Some of his few cartoonish drawings, he has these monopods with these boat-like feet in there. They're upside down using their feet as umbrellas.
Yeah.
So he took this classical motif and obviously turned it into very comic.
Yeah.
They're actually sort of deformed dwarves. We learn later. We're going to meet more treacherous and scary dwarves in the last battle.
Yeah.
There's several interesting things going on. One is the monopods themselves and their utter inability to think independently. All they do is throw out these tautologies for the chief. The magician, it actually mentions that Koryakan is under some kind of punishment.
Yeah.
Even a seemingly benevolent magician, Lewis had ambivalent feelings about magic, and most of the time there's something wrong with magic. You're trying to impose your will on reality.
Yeah.
So even this good magician is being punished for something he did wrong as a star.
Why does he call it deep magic then, which is very positive in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe?
Well, if magic comes from Aslan, it's good. They noticed there was magic when we didn't talk about the portal where they're looking at the picture of the Dawn Treader, and then they all fall into the picture.
Yeah.
That's a great scene. But whenever the magic comes from Aslan, it's legitimate because his will is perfect. But if you try magic with a small m, then its chances are it's not legitimate. You're somehow trying to impose your will on others or impose your will on reality.
Because when Lucy reads the spell about making them visible again, or making all things visible, Aslan just shows up and he says, well, why would I not obey my own magic? As if to imply that any sort of power that there is for these things to be accomplished is actually Aslan's power, which seems like it kind of blurs that line there, though.
Yeah, that's true. You wonder if there are other magical entities, like why the thing where she looks in the mirror and she has on a beard.
What's up with I love that because there's the bearded glass, and then as the narrator, he's like, "Yeah, I don't know what a bearded glass is.
Yeah,
Little kids, don't ask me. I'm not a magician."
Exactly.
So, but yeah, there's that episode there with Lucy, and she's very much tempted. It's almost like she's tempted to become Helen of Troy, almost, sort of where people are going to fight over her.
Right.
What's going on there?
She has several temptations. As I say, even Lucy, who's the most spiritually sensitive of all the Pevensey children, she has the temptation to become more beautiful than her sister. Her sister's always been the beauty of the family.
Yeah.
And men will almost worship her for her beauty. And she wants to do the spell. What keeps her from doing the spell? Does the page get stuck? Or I'm trying to remember why she's not allowed to say the vow that will make her.
I think she just keeps reading, and she thinks she's going to go back to it, and then she can't turn the page back.
Yeah, somehow she's prevented.
Yeah.
Well, I love the incident as she's turning the pages, because one of the spells is how to turn the head of a man into an ass's head. And they insert the reference to Bottom from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Right. So this novel is just filled with literary allusions. But I think what we're supposed to pick up as the power of that incident is that she's tempted by the spell to turn beautiful. But then it says that when she sees Aslan, she looks more beautiful.
Oh, gotcha.
So it's not about just physical beauty.
Yeah.
It's about the beauty of her spirit, and that she is reflecting Aslan's character, which of course we see her doing even in the way she responds to Eustace. I would have had no patience with Eustace. And so here he has justified sneaking off to get water, and then we discover that Lucy has been giving her part of her ration of water to Eustace, but not in a self-righteous like, just take some of mine.
Mm-hmm.
She instead says, well, girls don't need as much water, which of course is absurd, but she doesn't want Eustace to feel bad about his selfishness.
Right.
I mean, that is beauty. It's beauty of character.
Yeah.
Well, she's always that way. She's the first one to recognize that the dragon is Eustace. She has this spiritual perceptivity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But you notice we're talking about ambiguous feelings toward magic. Many of the things in the book are temptations that she needs to resist. She needs to resist the idea that I'll be the most beautiful woman on earth and everyone will seek my hand. She needs to resist the eavesdropping on her friends.
Although she doesn't resist that.
Well, she learns that she should have resisted.
Yeah.
Aslan says eavesdropping is eavesdropping regardless of whether you do it by magic or not.
Yeah.
And even the beautiful story with the cup and the sword and the green hill, she wants to relive it again. She wants to go back and go through it again.
Yeah.
But Lewis has this principle of not trying to repeat the experience of joy.
Yeah, you see that in Paralandra. That's a huge thing there, yeah.
Yeah, so once you have the experience, you just enjoy it and remember it, but you don't try to repeat it. He says it's like trying to listen to a symphony twice in one day.
Well, and he says in Paralandra, to tie this back to the example we had about money and greed that sort of runs through the story, which is money would be a way of saying encore that could not be ignored in Paralandra, implying that it becomes a way of doing something that you shouldn't do, but you justify it because you're experiencing something that's enjoyable, whether it's eating berries with the red hearts, or
right.
Experiencing something, and
the bubble tree, right?
Yeah, so money becomes a way of getting what you want that is in your mind good, but in the end, destroys you basically
right.
from the inside.
Right.
And you gave the example earlier of pride. So how interesting to include that just brief little allusion to Bottom, the character in Midsummer Night's Dream, because his limitation is he's so proud. He thinks he can play all the roles, and he ends up becoming looking on the outside, what he is on the inside, which is just kind of interested in his own self-serving stardom in this play that the Rude Mechanicals are putting on. So he becomes an ass because he's been acting like an ass, and that's the pun from Shakespeare. But that's like Eustace, who has been acting like a greedy dragon, and he becomes that greedy dragon.
Yeah.
People who define themselves by gold, they become a statue of gold. And so you used that word monster earlier, Aaron, and I think that the Bottom illusion and all these things are talking about how we end up dehumanizing ourselves through the choices we make, through self-serving choices.
You mentioned the word ass. I love the line where Eustace is recovered and he feels so terrible about how he's been behaving. And Edmund says, well, you were only an ass. I was a traitor.
Yeah. I like that he has Edmund and Eustace have that moment.
Yes.
Right.
Where he feels like he can tell Edmund this, and Edmund's like, yeah, I get it. I've been there. I went through something like that myself, but Aslan helped me, and so that was a really neat moment in the novel. But in Lewis, to me, his moral redemption that he keeps trying to give these characters in these moments, I think is one of the highlights of the stories. Going back and rereading them for me.
Yeah, I agree. And right after the passage you're talking about, Eustace says, "Do you know Aslan?" And Edmund says, "Well, he knows me."
Yeah.
That was a wonderful insight. Very succinct.
That'll preach. That's a good line.
Yeah,
you could preach a sermon on that one.
Oh my goodness.
So let's talk about the beginning of the end of the world, and then let's get to the end of the world. So the beginning of the end of the world, what's going on there with Ramandu? He's a star that is now in human form, and who is this daughter, and what's going on there? What is Lewis portraying there in that situation?
Well, once again, there's an incident in the Voyage of St. Brendan where they go to an island. They're seeking the island of Promise, which is an earthly paradise. That's their quest.
Oh, okay.
And as they get close to it, they meet an old man with a long white beard. And this is the one that the animals feed, and they have grapes the size of apples. In this, as they're approaching the island, Lucy says it has kind of a dim purple smell. And I think Lewis is thinking of this island of grapes in the Voyage of St. Brendan.
Oh.
But he's the kind of prophet that tells you you're almost there. In these medieval tales, there's always a sage or a hermit. We're going to run into this again when we get to Horse and His Boy.
Yeah.
Who kind of serves as your guide.
Yeah.
So yes, he says in the Middle Ages, they didn't think of stars as balls of gas. I mean, they thought of them as as gods or part of God's order.
Yeah.
Part of the great dance. Matter of fact, it actually says...
He actually says the great dance.
Right.
Get back to the great dance, which once again reminds you of Paralandra.
Yeah.
So I think once again, he's trying to revivify the medieval worldview and show it to you imaginatively.
Gotcha.
And when Eustace says, well, in our world, it's just a ball of gas. And he says, well, no, that's not what it is. That's what it's made of.
Yeah.
So we should mention that Ramandu's daughter later becomes Caspian's wife.
Yes.
They have an
that
allusion
comes
to
out
Sleeping
in
Beauty.
this,
That,
doesn't it?
yeah, that's right. That does.
But the episode with Caspian and the sailors feels very much like Gideon from the Book of Judges.
Except what I like about Caspian's technique here is he uses reverse psychology on them.
Right.
And he says he can see all these people are hesitant to join, understandably.
Yeah.
And then he tells them, well, I can't take you all. I'm just going to have to think through who would be the best people to accompany me. And so it turns into an honor to be able to go. And it was just really brilliant. And he implies that he came up with this in so far as earlier he says, well, I have something up my sleeve.
You have one more card to play.
Right, right.
So then they're sailing towards the end of the world. They've got the sailors that have passed the test, and Lucy has this experience of seeing these underwater civilization.
Right.
Which reminded me kind of Perelandra when Ransom is riding on the sort of dolphin creature and he sees the animals. Is Lewis trying to depict Atlantis here? What's going on?
Well, it's another medieval legend, or it goes all the way back, classical legend, the Mer people.
Okay.
And he loves to take things that are only mythical or legendary in our world, and they're real in Narnia. And they always say, I thought that men were only a myth. That keeps coming up in their world. The whole thing about a round planet, well, why don't you fall off the bottom? They can't really imagine what a round world would be like, because their world is flat although Lewis himself said that they didn't really think the world was flat.
No.
He gives several allusions and says that's a common misconception. They've known that Earth was round going back to Ptolemy, don't they? I think he gives several examples.
Yeah. Well, and it was one of those enlightened myths that was spread. Those dumb Christians thought the world was flat, and the whole mythology about Columbus.
Yeah. Although there's people that think the world is flat now, so
No, we're still hearing about them.
Yeah. And in fact, one famous scholar, Marjorie Hope Nicholson, says this whole mythology that the world's flat, she believes came from the idea that rabbinical scholars assumed before the fall, the world was smooth. It was flat. So it was round, but it was flat insofar as there were no mountains.
Circle, right?
Yeah. And that mountains are the result of the fall. And that we talked a little bit about that in one of our romanticism conversations, that's why mountains were considered ugly, because they were manifestations of the fall. So that's her theory as I understand it.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's interesting because they realize the climate under the ocean is different, so that the mountains are like the valleys.
Once again, the inverse of our world, just like Caspian will soon use an inverse psychology.
Yeah.
And that's what happens in Perelandra again. He sees the Mer people, and when he eats some seaweed, he starts taking on their point of view. And so the surface of the water looks to them like clouds, because that's above them. That's not below them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting passage once you get in Perelandra.
Yeah.
Speaking of illusions, she talks about the water being drinkable light.
Yeah.
And that's a phrase from Milton's Paradise Lost.
Oh, really?
Wow.
He's wonderful about interweaving pretty serious literary allusions in a very realistic and unobtrusive way into a children's story.
Right.
Yeah, that is an interesting concept, is they drink the water, they're able to actually perceive the light more and more, and it gets brighter and brighter, which is very much, he's sort of evoking this biblical idea of, in the New Jerusalem, there's no longer any night, which in that sense is symbolizing, because night was this time of fear and insecurity, and bad things happen at the night. And so there's this, symbolizing this idea that, Christ will be our source of light, and there's no need to be afraid anymore. But Lewis is actually sort of personifying this in the story. At the end of the world, there's this, brilliant light that they can see because they drink this water. And it's very interesting.
Well, and it's also a counterpoint, once again, to Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which has that famous line repeated, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink. And Reepicheep discovers the water is sweet, which means there's water everywhere, and it's all good to drink.
Yeah.
Right. And then they get to the Sea of Lilies. We're going to get into a lot of very strong biblical imagery. As I say, he thought this might be a trilogy, and he wanted to make sure that you understood the Sea of Lilies. Crystal, you were going to comment on that, weren't you?
Yeah, what's going on with the lilies? What's the symbolism of that?
Lilies is a century-old symbol for the Virgin Mary. So it goes way back. I have a play that I used to teach that's actually from the 12th century. It's called The Play Representing Adam, and it basically traces the development from the Old Testament into the fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And one of the things it picks up on is the fact that Aaron's rod had flowers on it, right?
It
bloomed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And in Latin, and of course the medieval authors of medieval drama, they're reading the Bible in the Latin. Aaron's rod is called virga. So then when Mary is presented, she's Virgo. So the Virga of Aaron's rod that is fertilized without being planted in the earth.
Yeah.
The Virgo, the Virgin Mary, is fertile without having a seed planted to her. And so the association of flowers on the Virga of Aaron's rod, they assumed, well, what is the most pure looking flower? And lilies are just that, white lilies. We think of Easter lilies and just the purity of the look of them. But you can go back and almost every single annunciation that you see, including as late as pre-Raphaelite images of the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary, the angel is holding a rod with lilies on it.
Oh, interesting.
And just to take it one point further, that little / on a typewriter is called a virgule, which means a little rod.
Really?
Yes. So
Are you serious?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah,
You're not making that up.
No, it's called a virgule, Virgule.
Wow.
Wow.
So we've gone all the way from theology to typology.
Well, we are talking typology.
Yeah.
It is
In
typology.
terms, in the theological studies, they talk about
yeah.
the typology. So Aaron's rod is a type of the Immaculate Conception of Mary.
Well, okay, so then they get in this boat. There's that whole scene where Caspian wants to go with them and he can't. Poor Caspian. I felt so bad for him. But he really fails in that moment in front of everybody. And then Aslan restores him, sort of in his chamber. He doesn't want to talk about it. And you're like, no, I want to hear what you talked about. But they get on the boat and they travel for 3 days. And I was like, okay, Lewis.
Yeah.
He's starting to get pretty heavy-handed there. And they travel for 3 days, and then they get to the end of the world, and Reepicheep goes over it. What is Lewis? He seems like he's almost describing the mountains that are in the Great Divorce, a sort of picture there, but I don't know what order. Did he write the Great Divorce before he wrote this?
Great Divorce is, 45, and this is 50 is when he wrote it and came out in 53.
Yeah, it feels very much like he's sort of describing the Great Divorce picture that he has of heaven with this mountain that kind of goes up and up, when they see over the wave.
But
he
also,
always thinks of heaven as mountains. That comes from Pilgrim's Regress, Great Divorce.
Yeah.
It's always natural. It's never the New Jerusalem
till we
or a
have
big
faces
city.
where she goes up the mountain. But talk about Lewis's impression of seeing the sea for the first time.
Well, when he was a little kid, the first time they went to visit the beach, the expansive sea going outward, he didn't have the right perspective. And he thought it was this gigantic wall of water that was about to fall down over him, like a tidal wave. And he was very frightened at first until his dad picked him up and he got a different view. And he suddenly realized that big wall was going out toward the horizon. That comes up again in Out of the Silent Planet. When he first gets to Mars, he said he saw this huge mass of water, and he suddenly realized it was an expanse of water going away from him.
Oh, okay.
Rather than a wall of water.
Yeah.
So he literally turns it into like a wall of water in this story. Right. Oh, wow, that's interesting.
There's also, once again, something from St. Brendan. They get to the Isle of Promise, this earthly Eden, and they get to an uncrossable river, and a young man who looks like an angel appears and says, "It's not your time to cross this river. Go back to where you came from."
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of that feeling with, it's okay for Reepicheep to cross over because this is his quest.
Yeah.
He's a knight, but he's also a mystic.
Yeah.
For Caspian, it's not appropriate. Lewis in Preface to Paradise Lost talks about your natural station in life and the great chain of being.
Yeah.
And one of the sins of a king is remissness, which is not doing your duty.
Yeah.
And he's tempted by the sin of remissness.
Yeah.
And it's okay for Reepicheep to continue the quest, but it's not okay for the king to abandon his people.
Yeah, he has responsibilities. And yeah, definitely.
Isn't it interesting? Reepicheep is described several times as sitting on Lucy's shoulder. So it actually physically aligns this funny-looking mouse with Lucy and the spiritual connection that they have with Aslan.
I felt also the moment when Reepicheep jumps out of the boat and he ends up drinking the water, that to me felt like a real turning point for him and his character. Because all along he's been sort of this voice of bravery, in several of the island situations, he's the one that's like, well, hey, we came this far. I don't want to, I don't want to say that I chickened out, after coming this far. I'm not going to give up. This is an adventure. That's what we're supposed to do, is do adventurous things. And everybody's like, okay, we'll spend the night with these creepy massive hair sleeping guys, because Reepicheep wants to do it. But you realize that he jumps out of the boat because he wants to attack the mer people for his honor. And then but when he drinks the water, then he realizes, oh, wait, this is it. And he almost lets go of that mission of, valor and honor and fighting. And he turns his face to the east very clearly from that point on. So I feel like that was a big turning point for Reepicheep. He's always been wanting to get to Aslan's country, but it was that sort of like last hurrah where he jumps out and then he drinks the water. And
reminds him what his whole quest is about.
Yeah. Right. It's once again, it reminds me of Coleridge, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because when the mariner, he blesses the creatures unaware, and it's almost like that experience. Reepicheep blesses those creatures that he was going to attack. He blesses them unaware, drinks the living water, the sweet water. Yeah. And after that, they describe that the boat kept sailing even though there was no wind, which is exactly what happens in Rime of the Ancient Mariner after the mariner blesses the creatures unaware.
Yeah, they catch this current and it takes them back. Yeah, definitely.
I love the scene of Lucy just seeing the little shepherdess or fish herdess.
Yes,
and they have this connection.
Yes.
And they become friends. And
and they say if they ever met some other world they would embrace. Yeah. These little poignant moments that he embeds in a children's story.
Yeah. So the river thing is the lamb turns into Aslan. But then they say, well, hey, when are we going to get to your country? And when they find out that they can't come back, and Aslan says, well, I am in your world. I'm different. But then he says, my country is across a river in your world. Is he evoking that idea from the St. Brendan's that you were talking about?
Well, it's basically the River Jordan, the river of death.
I'm Pilgrim's Progress, you have to cross a river before you get to...
Yeah. I loved when he said, I brought you here to get to know me a little so that you would know me better there. And he gives these clues. The little girl wrote and said... is there any way that we can get to Aslan's country? And he said, well, there's no way to get there until after death. But he said a few very saintly people get glimpses before then. Once again, he's thinking of mystics who have these visions
definitely.
Before death. But he actually told this little girl, she says, well, what's Aslan's name in our world? And he said, well, think about it. Who came to earth right around Christmas? Who sacrificed himself for other people? And he basically just lays out all these characteristics of Christ to try to help her make the connection.
Yeah.
I forgot to say earlier when Aslan means lion in Turkish. So it's interesting that he's originally conceived of as a lion. But in this book, we see him as a lamb. We see him as an albatross.
Yeah.
One time he's the medallion.
Like the Holy Spirit, really.
Yeah. Some people think that the Aslan is most like Christ in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. He's most like God the Father when we visit Aslan's country in the beginning of the Silver Chair, and he's most like the Holy Spirit here. He doesn't fight their battles for them, but he's a comforter, he's a guide.
Yeah, he has to leave the island with Lucy because he's got to go do something in Narnia, and there's very much this like sort of almost like resurrected Jesus where he can kind of go from place to place, or the Holy Spirit appearing in different forms. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, I think that this story, for me, out of all the stories, we mentioned that it's episodic, but I also feel that it does a better job of evoking Sehnsucht. All of these different episodes, Lewis kind of gives you a different take on it, and it makes you want to go to Aslan country and drink this water that's sweet, that's like drinkable light. It creates a desire in you, this Sehnsucht that only Aslan, or Christ in our world can fulfill. And so I think this novel accomplishes that in a better way, I think, than at least the ones we've read previously.
That's probably a good note to end on.
I think so. And we want to go on record from this conversation as saying we're against slavery and we don't believe in a flat earth. So just to kind of get our policies out there for our listeners.
So what novel are we going to be reading next,
We're
David?
going on to The Silver Chair.
All right.
Number 4.
Does get a chance to come back to Narnia. And it's actually my favorite of the Narnia Chronicles.
Mine too.
Oh, okay. All right.
So we will check in with you all in a couple of weeks and talk about number 4 in the Narnia Chronicles.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.